Hey, hello everybody, and welcome to what is Volume 7 of Office Hours with Professor Pat. I cannot believe that it's Volume 7. Anyway, I'm Pat. I'm the co-founder of Zia Consulting, as well as the Capture Practice Lead. And so we're going to talk about stuff. What that stuff is people, technology, and how we're going to do things. People, there's not a big community, at least within the Ephesoft community, as well as cohabitating amongst other technologies. So I'm trying to provide at least one of an avenue for that. The technology we're going to talk about is going to be mostly focused on Ephesoft, but and I want to talk about other technologies as well. So if there are other technologies that you'd like to talk about or at least compare to, love to hear from you, and we will get that scheduled. This is very informal, so even though I prepare some content, I have no problem getting sidetracked with another topic or even taking a look at something in real time. I'm going to try to keep it pretty focused today, mostly because it's going to be a little death by presentation. One of the things that really isn't covered, or at least not covered well, in my opinion, is just optimization for performance, administration, as well as, and this is really not covered, best practices for configuration management. So let's go ahead and start there. So starting with the optimization, there's some things that are obvious, some things that are less obvious. The CPU is going to be a major factor. Way back in the day when we started doing this stuff around 10 years ago with Ephesoft, we really didn't think of the CPU, or at least was a big haul in the sense of performance. However, what we're seeing is that, and it just makes sense, there is a lot of computation. So that computation is creating OCR, creating thumbnails, creating preview images. So it's really important to do that. One of the keys around that and is turning off hyperthreading as well, and that has to go bare metal machine. Hyperthreading is just really not good for long transactions, and so there is, depending on virtualization that you have on there, it's just not as performant as it could or should be. So turn that off. If you have it off, you're going to see a big difference. Solid state disks, essentially that same thing that I talked about with CPU. There's a whole bunch of things that are going on in the sense of transformations and reading and computations. And a lot of that has to do with opening and creating files. So the faster that network speed is, or that disk speed is, the more that transactions are going to be performant. If you have a network share for your shared folder, so if you have a clustered environment in which you're actually pointing to on your various Ephesoft nodes, make sure that the network speed has the same kind of write access. I've seen instances where somebody has a NAS or the like that they're using on their shared folders, and the network speed or the input-output operations per second, the IOPS from that Ephesoft machine to the disk is just not as fast as it could be, and could be causing you great pain in the sense of performance. Database. So even though the database isn't highly used, it is used for the configuration of the different batch classes and reporting. Reporting is a higher database intensive transaction when it comes to Ephesoft. Make sure you have enough resources on the machine. And I've seen a lot of people try to share it amongst other applications, and they're surprised when all of a sudden there's issues either with the other application or with Ephesoft. And it could be during the reporting time, and it could be that you have advanced reporting, which is more CPU intensive. So don't be surprised if that's going on, and change it if it's having an effect on your database. If you're virtualized, reserve the CPU and the memory. So pinning, reservations, whatever it may be. The way that virtualization works is that you can kind of overload a server with more CPU and memory than is necessary. Even if you don't have it overloaded, it could be not optimized. And the reason that it's not optimized is because that memory and that CPU may be used for multiple virtual machines underneath that physical server. And so when that occurs, swapping occurs. And so it could be that memory has to go in and out, that it's not using the cache appropriately. These are again these are long-term transactions with with classification or OCRing and transformations that take place. Reserve those. Get as much as you can off of the CPU. One thing that I didn't mention here is the database really should be on a separate server. I know that there's options and the capabilities of just installing it on a local database, and this is at least for your production server. There's no reason why you would have utilize CPU for the database. That is not just utilize every single piece of resource for the Ephesoft licenses that you're purchasing. So even though you can, don't. Just keep them on those on separate boxes, and that gives you the capability of kind of playing around with being able to cluster as well. So antivirus, make exceptions for Ephesoft installation and shared folders. You do not know how many times I've had customers say, yeah, it's off. It's as an exception, and then we spend like a month debugging performance issues, and then we're seeing these task management processes spin up. That can cause at least performance errors, issues, if not actual errors. And those errors are just contention with resources. So Ephesoft's very fast in the sense of it looks at these resources very quickly. So when it's processing, it creates OCR, then it reads the OCR from a file. If there's contention with that thing it just created to be able to open it with another process, you're going to have some issues with performance, if not those errors that I mentioned. And this is something that not everybody knows about or is doing, but if you have a single node, meaning that you have one Ephesoft server, so you don't have a clustered environment that is load balanced and for DR or HA rather, overload it. If you have the resources, throw 8 cores on a 4-core system, or 16 on a 12, or whatever you have. Ability of having more overhead for the operating system, and not just for Ephesoft, and contention between Ephesoft and the operating system. And I just realized I didn't open up my questions, but I will open that up. And of course, if you have questions about this or something else you want me to deviate, let me know. The overloading will not work on a clustered environment. And so the way that the license server works is that when a server comes up, it'll say, okay, I'm going to allocate this many cores to you. If there is a system that goes to the license server that's an 8-core, it will say, okay, well, I have you have 8 cores, and so I'm going to allocate those 8 cores from the license server. So it will not work in a clustered environment. So that's just the way it is right now. Any case, any questions on optimization? There are more things that I'm just kind of hitting high-level topics on people that I've seen. I've seen people try to overclock systems to make it very optimized for Ephesoft, which actually worked pretty well. But you can get really good performance if you just follow some basic rules and throw some hardware at it. You're going to see your ROI go folds because memory is cheap, CPU is pretty cheap. Utilize what you can to get as much throughput or higher SLAs than you can for your Ephesoft licenses. All right, so let's move into logging. There is a log that a lot of people don't look at, and that's the installation log. And so when you first create an instance of Ephesoft, there is a log that's created on that server. Do not always assume that it says that it's successful for the installation, that you had complete success. I've seen instances where perhaps a table wasn't written to the database or some other thing that you have to troubleshoot and fix after the fact that you have that instance up. After you get that installation or during it, look at that Ephesoft log, and that's going to help you with support as well. So whether you're working with us or you're working with another channel partner or Ephesoft, that's going to help diagnose what happened with a particular installation. And it's located under that installation. The user that installed the Ephesoft application. One thing to note is just make sure that you're also following the installation. A lot of people will just run the MSI and not really pay attention that they should be, using an administration launch off a command line, or not look at the prerequisites. So this isn't necessarily administration part, maybe it is, but just make sure that you're following those directions. So even though you're doing maybe your third installation or your 10th, just have a checklist. Make sure that you're doing the right thing. That way you don't end up in a bad place. Hate wasting time. There's not enough time in the day already. So then there's the Ephesoft logs, and we'll take a quick look at what that looks like. So within the Ephesoft logs, and so Ephesoft is a web application that runs in an application server. That application server is Tomcat. So if you think about it, there's the application, and then there's the container of Tomcat. And so there's the two different logs. Often, if you're working with support, or if you just want to run it at a different level, you might want to change the logging levels. And so let's go ahead and go see what that looks like. So you can see that right now I'm looking at the DCMA all log, which is one of the 3 logs that are inside of the logs and the Ephesoft application logs. And let's go ahead and take a look at what those look like. There's also a RecoStar one, so there's actually 4. And you can all manipulate the logging level. So there's going to be more verbosity as you go down the level. By default, Ephesoft is logging at error. And so when there's an error that occurs, there's going to be something inside of this log that shows you what that error is in a stack trace, because it's an error. Right now, you can see that this is running at info level. So it's going to tell you the various levels that the particular line is running at. You can go all the way, and this is using log4j. You can go all the way from error to debug being the most verbose. I got a question in, but it's talking about future information. So, okay, future topics, so I'll just skip that for now. The way that you control the logging levels is this inside of the that same folder that we were just in, Ephesoft application. There is this log4j.xml file. And you can see those files are defined here. So here's the DCMA all log, the user log, and the report log. And then below that, you can see that there's various classes. So this is using Java connotation. So these are the different packages and what level it is logging at. So you can see that right now, I'm logging at an info level. By default, that's error. One thing that you can do, which I just threw in here for an example, is we have some custom code, the Zia custom library of helper functionality when you're scripting. And if I wanted to, I can say specifically this particular class, I want that to be at debug. And so everything that is coming out or running inside of that particular class, I want to run at a very verbose level. And not dirty my logs out with just everything under the sun that's coming out of Ephesoft. So let's go ahead and move on. But that's the logging that's inside of there. And then there's very much similar logs at the container level I'm not going to go into right now. But there are Tomcat logs located under the Java App Server logs. And that will give you the capability of looking at it. So if you have an issue with configuration around the Active Directory configuration, or that you are messing with some sort of security, those log errors will show up there. One of the things that a lot of people don't have set up is that you can configure those errors that we're talking about in that side of the Ephesoft log to send emails to an IT group or whomever it might be administrating the particular servers. So inside of this file that I'm locating, I'm not going to, well, I can show you what it is. You can just list the SMTP server, the password, the username that you're using on side of there. And then every single time there's going to be like a trap, and it's going to send that email with the stack dump of what happens to whatever group or user that you have listed inside of this username. or inside of the group, the to and the from. So that is important and will help you diagnose. But other things to look out for, which happen often, is if you have a tool, I listed at the very end here, Splunk might be one of them, which is a good tool. Some of my customers that really have a mission critical Ephesoft server that's looking for traps inside of the log. It's looking for resources on machines. It's looking for any sort of alerts that are going on at the system level. It's going to give you really good information to try to figure out and diagnose issues. I've seen it so many times where we get on a support call and it's all because of running out of disk space or that some other really an obvious issue that's going on with the system that's not that obvious if you're not looking at it. Space within the database and your resource allocation, CPUs going off the charts. So if you can monitor those things like any sort of application, just monitor those things. So install and have data location other than the operating system. There are a lot of people that do an installation just kind of say, okay, install to, if you have Windows, install to the C drive and move on. The problem with that is once your C drive fills up, like I was mentioning before, then you can't even get to the operating system to debug what's going on. So try to have a D, an E, an F server, perhaps one for applications and one for data, and make sure that you do that the same thing with your database, and where you're keeping your database files is where's your database logs, and that way you stay out of trouble. Again, real-time virus installs, make sure that you make exceptions, and I listed this twice because a lot of people just don't do this or decide that they don't want to do this, and then all of a sudden they're questioning why they're not having the performance that they think they should have. All right. Any questions? I know that this is death by presentation or death by slides, but I think that this is near and dear to my heart with some things that people just don't look at within their systems. This last one is really something that we've been talking at ZIA. So this is something that we've been, this is a ZIA-ism. This isn't really necessarily, like where the logs are. These are kind of some of the best practices we follow. I would love to hear what you do or do differently. Configuration management is just how you promote different configurations throughout your different environments. So, dev to staging, or UAT to staging to production, and how you actually retain those files in some sort of source code system, as well as how you're doing deployments. I've seen a lot of customers where they're just exporting document types and throwing them in production, which works, but the problem with that is that you don't really have a good disaster recovery story, or it's more difficult to have a good disaster recovery story. If you're migrating over different servers, you may be missing something. That has to be a very stringent process if you're doing things like that. So in any case, let's talk about it for a second. So Ephesoft has the capability within their batch class management to export and import batch classes. And so a very easy way to do that is that you develop things on your development system, and then you move to your staging system, and then eventually move to your production system, or however many lower environments you may have. I have some up to 9 different environments that are in lower environments before you go inside of a production system. So that part is very simple, but a lot of people don't really have a good story when it comes to labeling what those exports are. Essentially, it's just a zip file. That zip file contains a couple things, and let me show you what it is. So if you look inside of your shared folders on any particular batch class, we'll do it real quick. There's all this different configuration. So it has to do with the samples that you sent up, the samples that you may have used for doing extraction configuration. So all the different good configurations, like if you have CMIS for mapping for export, various other exports, your scripts, all of this information then is wrapped inside of that export. And then there's going to be a serialized file, because all of the configuration that you do, for all the way down to what plugins you're using, what those properties are in the plugins, to what kind of document types and what kind of fields they have inside of there, and all the extraction rules are inside of the database. So that export contains all these different things inside of the shared folder, as well as that serialized file that has everything that was inside of the database. A lot of people will just kind of export those kind of ad hoc and move them up with no real configuration of how they actually, knowing what they have in another one, in one system or the other. That is partly due because there's not really a good system for being able to manage the versions that are inside of Ephesoft. So that when you look at the versions that are inside of Ephesoft in batch class management, you'll see that this has version 1007. That doesn't really mean anything. Every single time that you come inside of here and do an apply, and then go back out here, well, I didn't make any changes, but that will increment up to being 178, 179. And so you can have, the first 3 digits really don't mean anything. The last one just kind of increments up, and you can have it in the thousands for how many times you've saved that file. That does go to the other, so if you export it, that will persist to whatever you go put it on the different system. However, if you pressed apply because you wanted to change an export setting or wanted to do something, it just increments up. So there's no way of locking that particular version system down. And so putting inside like a repository like Git or whatever you do, SourceForge, or it's just something, Git repository or SVN or whatever you use for all of your code, you can use that. If you're using something like Git, you might want to use something like the LFS, the large file system for exports. Like if you're in mortgage, or even if you're in some AP type of accounts and you have a lot of samples in there, this can get to like a gigabyte of an export. So huge. So try to be optimized when you're using one of those source control systems. Now we're talking about moving it from one place to another, and so what you can do is move that and overwrite it in another system. So what I mean by that is you have a particular version running inside of your production system. Eventually, you want to put this new definition up there. By default, there's a configuration that says if there's any running batches inside of that batch class, if the running batch instances inside of that batch class, just throw an error and say you can't update this. There's instances, which is not really a thing that you can do. I have customers that have thousands of batches at any given time, and we can't really tell people, get through all of those and then we'll upgrade it. That's just a time that will never occur. So there is a setting where you can specify that you want to override it. However, it has its challenges of its own. Number one, it increments your batch class identifier. So if you had a BC3, it's going to be a BC4 that overwrites that. That is only a problem because if you have anything that is like pointing to a web service and it maybe have configurations to say BC3 as opposed to BC4, then you have to update any of those kind of configurations as well. So just note that and have a process in place where you know that you're going to update all of those different configurations. Another one that we've seen is an issue with the running batches. So the running batches are one thing. So that means that there's batches that are batch instances that are literally in the running state while you do an update. As soon as you're done with that, you may want to then restart those batches or the batch instances. Again, that will take on the new batch class definition, but it won't leave it in a weird state. One of the things that we just seen, and to be honest, this was the impetus of like me coming up with all these different topics for this week, is that we started seeing with this large customer of ours that has like a lot of large clusters. When we update the batch class, we were noticing that there was some duplications of the batch instances, which is hideous, because at that point you needed to then go up and like figure out what is a duplicate and clean them all up, and it was just terrible. What we found out that to be is that it turns out that there was duplicating because it was not necessarily the running batches, but it was the folder monitor. And so when the folder monitor was running things and new things were coming in, they were still getting processed or picked up And so what that folder monitor does is it converts all of those. It says, hey, there's a new batch instance, and then starts creating all the transformations of PDFs to single page TIFFs. When that is occurring, there's something going on where we're seeing these duplication of batches. So what we're testing right now, and it seems to be successful with that particular client, is we're just turning off, like we have a maintenance window, and we're turning off Ephesoft from all folder pickup. And so what we end up doing is we update this expression, and this only works, there's two ways of doing folder monitor. One of them, which is the default way, is jnotify, and it's just kind of like a trigger. So there's like something that's monitoring this particular folder, and then when something lands in that folder, there's an event that happens that says, hey, there's something new in this folder. The other way you can do it is cron, and I recommend cron anyway if you're not using it. We've seen instances where jnotify, I don't know, just like forgets, loses its attachment to that particular folder, and then new things aren't processing, and you have to restart things anyway. I'm not seeing that on if you do cron job. So a cron job is just a specified time frame of saying, hey, look here every minute or wherever you have it set up, and when you see there, look for new folders in this case. So what we end up doing is we modify that folder monitor if you're using cron to some year that's not happening right now, so it's just not looking at all to see if anything's going on. And then we modify it back once we update the batch classes to monitor those folders, and we are not seeing the issue right now. I do have a question coming in. How can you use Git for Ephesoft for doc type export to production? Can one automate if BC is new on Git? And export into production. Okay, so there's a way that you can export, and we're talking about batch class export right now, but there's ways that you can do a doc type export as well. And let me reserve that. We'll hold that till we get to the next slide, because this is kind of that's kind of like an alternative to what we recommend. So my recommendation is, kind of keep those at the batch class level. If you have 1,000 doc types, that might not be capable, especially if you're 24/7. So let me get through this, and then we'll talk about that particular question. But you can, the other part is properties management. So now originally we're talking about everything that's in a batch class, but there's also a bunch of configuration that's at the server level. And we were having a bunch of problems, years back when we didn't really have a good story for this around the configuration of the server. And so we could have 3, 6, 9 different servers that we have different configuration for. And that configuration is at the server level is Active Directory, how many batch instances should it process, which ones are UI servers, so it shouldn't be processing anything. There's a bunch of different DCMA properties, as well as some server level properties, as well as reporting properties that you may or may not be overriding the default behavior on. So what we came up with is a capability of being able to create targeted overlays. And so in this case, we know that Ephesoft has a particular folder structure. So, Ephesoft application, Java app server, a bunch of files underneath those, and eventually the properties files. And so what we ended up doing is we can create, in this case, a Git repo, and that Git repo might have all the different targets for all the different servers that we have to manipulate. So you can create a build, which is essentially a zip file of all those different properties that we're going to overwrite in a different server. And so we can just say, target dev, target stage, target production. And then once we have that, then we can actually just unzip that file and then be able to have a system essentially in the state that we want it at. This will also allow you to have disaster recovery because a lot of times you'll just miss when you're doing upgrades or you're moving servers or any of those things that you don't really have a good notion of what all you changed just because somebody that did the installation so happened to configure the Ephesoft server in such a way that you wanted it to behave, but didn't really take good notes or didn't really have the capability of being able to verbalize this to anybody else to know what that configuration is. I recommend this overlay. It might be a little bit confusing, but essentially we just have a structure of just like I don't know if you're using Maven or Ant or whatever it is. Essentially, having different configurations for different targets, building that zip file in the appropriate fashion that has the folder structure that would represent your particular Ephesoft installation, and then be able to unzip that over an installation, and then you magically have all your configuration. One thing to note is when you are doing an upgrade, make sure to compare those files, because it may have been that new properties were introduced. And so do a diff between what you have and what is inside of the out of the box, and just make sure that you're not missing new keys that might have been there or changed values that might be in there. Okay, so to get to your question, I can think of some ways that you could do that. So if you think about like the continuous integration standpoint, do that being this question around doing like dynamic doc type export imports into production. So I can think of a way to do that if you have web services. And so if you have web services, then you have the capability of being able to export doc types, and depending on what version you have, the different web services available. But you can export a particular document type, and then you can import a particular document type. So you could create some logic, like whether you're using Puppet or Chef or whatever you're using, you may be able to create some rules around deployment of those things to different environments. So you could say, you export all the different document types inside of a repository, or ones that are in a repository, take a look at, and then import those to a different targeted system. So that's one of the ways that I can think that you might be able to either create a new batch class dynamically, or just update a batch class that's existing with particular doc types. Then the other part around that, yeah, I think I would just have to know more about the rules that you would want to actually see those, or how you'd want to behave. But web services to be able to automate that kind of system, as well as what I'm talking about right now. So if you wanted to import the batch class, and override a batch class, and do it overlays, all of that could be automated. The one part that I have not considered is that new part that I was talking about of like turning off folder monitor. That I would have to ponder a little bit, because essentially you could do it like turn off the service, change some configuration, turn it back on once it's up, import stuff, and then be able to again change some configuration and restart it again. So I guess that even that could be done. That's kind of what I want. I know that this is kind of dry material, depending on what your passion is for configuration management and optimization of an Ephesoft server. So I purposely kept this one. Well, actually, I didn't even keep that short. It was about a half hour. But in any case, do we have any other questions? I don't even see any other questions. So I will call Volume 7 wrapped. Thank you all for attending, and I appreciate you coming back. I think that we have one more slated. If you guys are finding value in these, and if there's other topics that you want to listen to, please let me know. We have one more slated, so let's load it up with what you want to listen to. And if you want more, then let's figure out what the appropriate cadence is, and if we just want to keep on going. So thanks again, and have a great day.